The years of 2008 to 2012 may be one of the most influential periods in footballing history, an ushering out of one generation towards a more tiki-taka possession-based football dominated by one nation on both the domestic and international stage. The collective haul between Barcelona and Spain saw them win everything. La Ligas, 2 Copa del Reys, 2 Champions Leagues, 2 European Championships and 1 World Cup. Despite vast dominance, longevity wasn't forthcoming though, as Spain only managed to finish in the last 16 in the 3 subsequent World Cups. This video seeks to understand how this Spanish generation managed to build such a dynasty through 3 primary chapters. The first explores the origins of La Roja, showcasing how Spain went from persistent underperformers on the international stage to serial victors winning everything in sight. The second analyses the scale of success achieved in the period and its synergy with Pep Guardiola's Barcelona. And the last considers the legacy of not just Spain but tiki-taka football as a whole, why the tactical system's supremacy eventually fell and the effect this had on Spain's subsequent performances on the international stage. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Spain's Dynasty 2008 to 2012. Chapter 1. Origins. Later in this video we're going to talk a lot about Spain's success, their title wins and style of play doing so. But at this juncture it's necessary to remind ourselves that Spain's record pre-2008 wasn't on par with your Germanys, your Italys, your Frances, etc. They were comfortably a tier below. Beginning with the World Cup, barring the 4th place in 1950, Spain had never progressed past the quarter-final stage and had been knocked out in the group stage 5 out of 13 times. Looking over the European Championships, the story is somewhat worse, but also somewhat better. They did win the 1964 tournament, albeit there was only 4 teams included, and they were the hosts. They finished second in Euro 1984, albeit again they only won 1 game outright. They relied on penalties in the other 2, and even their 1 win came in the 90th minute. Spain have also missed 5 out of 12 tournaments through not qualifying. I don't outlay this to mock Spain or diminish them. I'm merely doing it to paint a true picture, one if anything enhances their achievements. What's interesting too is the style of play that's so synonymous with Spain these days, which is possession-based tiki-taka football. That wasn't always the case. La Furia Roja was their nickname, the Red Fury, born out of Spain's physical style of play they were previously known for. The direct, physical style Spain played wouldn't have looked out of place in a 90s lower league English football match. It was ugly, and more importantly, it was unsuccessful. Then one man came and changed it all when Johan Cruyff turned up in Barcelona in 1988. The Spanish Giants had won just 1 title out of the last 14 when he arrived. They had won 11 trophies in 8 seasons thereafter. But more importantly, he changed the face of Spanish football to one of beauty. It wasn't just enough to win, you had to win well. This inspired change across the nation. Young players grew up wanting to play for that Barcelona side and therefore works on their technical side. The system has had its head turned too. It didn't want to just import the best talents, it wanted to mould them itself. It wanted to be the envy of the world. Training in academies therefore became very, very heavily reliant on technique and flair. Scouts from the senior national team would be sent out across the country to find the best talents to get them integrated into the national team setup as early as possible. And by 2004, Spain had a coach that lived and breathed those tiki-taka principles, Luis Aragonés. It's largely forgotten now that Spain's first triumph in Euro 2008 was under Aragonés and not Vicente del Bosque. For change to occur, failure is often the root cause, and that was the case back at Euro 2004. Inaki Saiz was leading that tournament for Spain as they went out in the group stage. Spain's national newspaper El Mundo was furious. A new date and a new place will enter the traumatic history of the Spain team in major tournaments. For them, it had been the same story yet again. They had good players and optimism was high, but ultimately mental fragility and lack of tactical identity would be their undoing again. AF Sport Daily added that the nation had failed again, and this time without an ounce of glory or even dignity. Change was needed, and they turned to 66-year-old Luis Aragonés. But it wasn't an immediate hit. Rejuvenating the team was his first mission. Andres Iniesta, Cesc Fabregas, David Villa, Sergio Ramos were all newcomers to his squad. The group stage that had cruelly knocked him out in Euro 2004 was a breeze at the 2006 World Cup. 3 wins from 3 8 goals scored, with 5 coming from the youthful striker force of David Villa and Fernando Torres. Spain looked good, and people thought maybe the curse was about to be ended. However, sometimes you just get unlucky draws. France was their opponents in the last 16, who had a poor start to the tournament, only finishing second in their group. And despite Spain taking an early lead in this one, it was France that would overcome them by 3 goals to 1. It was unlucky, but those same question marks remained over Spain's mental resilience, and another early round defeat was there for all to see. Now, before we move on to the next tournament, Euro 2008, it's integral to look at the synergy between Spain and Pep Guardiola's Barcelona B and the golden era of La Masia. Changing Spain's style was not an overnight thing, and not one that could be resurrected in one tournament. And the same was true of Barcelona at the time. Frank Rijkaard was manager at the time, and the club was rotten from top to bottom. Guardiola had just taken over at the B team, who had just been relegated to the 4th tier. He overhauled the structure entirely, merging the B and C teams together. Fines were introduced to increase professionalism. In-depth opposition scouting, something that wasn't even being done in the senior team, was also brought in, which is now an industry standard. The biggest change though was the Tiki-taka style on the pitch. A true revolution at the club, one that hadn't been seen since Johan Cruyff had been there himself. Sometimes football works in a funny, almost suspicious way. As Spain were heading into their greatest era in football, so was Barcelona, and the two systems had so much synergy between them. Would Guardiola's Barcelona be as successful without Aragones and Del Bosque, and would the same be true the other way round? Chapter 2. Success. Heading into Euro 2008, you would have been wrong to assume that Spain was destined to win. There were many question marks over the head of Luis Aragones and his decision making going into the tournament. Brutally blunt at times, Aragones had a penchant for not endearing himself to the public. Just a few months before Euro 2008, it had leaked that the Spanish Football Federation were already seeking to replace Aragones after the tournament, with some speculating he might not even make it that far. This obviously didn't come to pass, but still showed that success under the older statesman was far from assured. Prior to the tournament, Luis Aragones had made another decision that brought fury to the fans. The decision to leave out legendary striker Raúl. With over 100 caps and 44 goals to his name, he was a legend of Spanish football. However, this same sentiment was not shared by Aragones, who felt that Raúl prioritised Real Madrid more than he did Spain. Furthermore, he was also seen as a relic of the past, one who'd failed in previous Spanish squads and didn't want his influence to pass over his new generation. There was outrage, but the manager stuck to his guns, believing that David Villa and Fernando Torres were the 2-star strikers for him. Looking at the Spain team for the opening match, it was clear that the identity Aragones had been going for was going to be fully tested. A stoic back four being anchored by Marcos Senna, whilst the technical players of Xavi, Iniesta, David Silva were allowed to play with freedom. The bench also included Fabregas, Cazorla, Alonso. They really were spoilt for choice. Up front, it had to be Torres and Villa, the latter of whom scored a hat-trick in the first game against Russia as they won 4-1. Whilst the first group game had been easy, the other two would not be so. Next came Sweden, who had the stars of Henrik Larsson, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Freddie Ljungberg, Olof Mellberg, all in their starting 11. Torres would score the opening goal, only to be pegged back by the inevitable Zlatan Ibrahimovic. The Swedes would defend with gusto throughout the match, only for David Villa to put in a 92nd minute winner. This saw Spain go through, and in the final group match, Aragones would rest his entire starting 11. Despite this though, Greece would actually go into the lead in this one. Karastias would give his nation the early goal. However, once again, Spain fought back, with Danny Giza scoring the winner in the 88th minute. This saw Spain win the group, and Greece was sent home. The quarterfinals came next, and Spain's first real test. World Cup holders Italy. A tight affair followed, or as those who watched it at the time would call it, boring. Spain dominated possession, and Italy just sat back and defended. No team could break the deadlock, and therefore it fell to penalties to find a victor. Casillas' heroics saw him save 2 penalties, and that would be enough to send Italy home. Spain had overcome their first test, or as Zan Perez puts, as a Spaniard, I don't effing care if it was boring, we've won. The semi-final saw a return of facing Spain, who they had dominated in the opening group game by 4-1. Since then though, Russia had come alive with Andrei Arshavin and Roman Pavlyuchenko becoming a deadly duo. Despite this though, history did repeat itself. Spain absolutely dominated Russia with goals from Xavi, Giza and David Silva. Spain had made the final and would face off against perennial winners Germany. They couldn't upset the apple cart, could they? Well, spoiler alert, they did win and they deserved to too. A lone goal from Fernando Torres in the first half proved to be enough, but in truth, Germany just couldn't get the ball off Spain. Aragonés had ended the curse. His decision to leave out Raúl had been vindicated. Spain were European champions, kick-starting their dynasty. David Villa ended as top scorer. Xavi was the best player. The Tiki-taka masterclass was in full effect, with Italy being the closest to stop it, which was just defending on their own box for 120 minutes. Going forwards though, Aragonés would not be the coach. The Spanish Football Federation had already made their decision despite him wanting to stay. Del Bosque was the man coming in. With the new man in charge, Del Bosque told his players he wasn't going to change things. It was going to be business as usual. On paper, Aragonés and Del Bosque were worlds apart. Aragonés was outspoken and brash, whilst Del Bosque was a quiet, reserved thinker. What was the same though was their tiki-taka principles that would remain into the next cycle. He reminded his players not to be complacent. With Spain achieving success, they now had a target on their back. He added a few players to the roster ahead of the tournament, namely Pedro, Javi Martinez, Juan Mata, Fernando Llorente and Jesus Navas, but to name just a few. More importantly though was the introduction of Sergio Busquets, who would replace Marcos Senna, who had retired from international football. This would see Spain further plant their feet in the tiki-taka system, with another passing midfielder added to the mix. As an aside, it's worth pivoting once again to see how Pep Guardiola was getting on at Barcelona. Pep was now the manager of Barcelona and had begun his ascent to football royalty. Champions League win in his first season, back-to-back La Liga titles, tiki-taka in full flow. 6 Barca players started in Spain's opening World Cup match. Simply, Barcelona was Spain and Spain was Barcelona. Going into the World Cup, Spain were the favourites and were desperate to deliver. The opening match saw them play Switzerland, which on paper seemed like an inevitable win. But as the old adage goes, football isn't played on paper, it's played on grass. And on grass, Switzerland took the win. Spain throughout the game played beautiful passing football but couldn't find an opening, and Switzerland got their goal on the counter to secure a 1-0 victory. You can bemoan the anti-football approach Switzerland took, but it was successful, and Spain had to react quickly to ensure the World Cup didn't pass them by. Fortunately, they did react. A 2-0 win over Honduras with David Villa picking up a brace. Chile would end their group stage and a win was needed to top the group and prevent an early exit. They duly delivered again with David Villa picking up another goal and Andres Iniesta grabbing the winner. Top of the group despite the setback and ready to face Portugal in the last 16. An all-Iberian clash to open the knockout stages. Portugal had a prime Cristiano Ronaldo, but Spain had a game plan. At this point, it had become customary for teams facing Spain to presume they weren't going to be able to touch the ball and instead try and spring on the counter-attack. Portugal continued this tradition and defended stoically, but were unable to prevent a David Villa goal, which saw Spain win 1-0. 1-0 being the key component. I have a feeling we may see a few of these before the tournament's out. Underdogs Paraguay had reached the quarterfinals for the first time in their history. Taking on Spain though would prove to be a very tricky task. Yet one has to commend them for rising to the occasion in the quarterfinal, as they proved to be a much more tricky challenge than Portugal had been. Iker Casillas had quite a lot to do in this game when Spain weren't dominating every single inch of possession. But this game, similar to the last one, was decided by David Villa, who got the only goal in the 83rd minute for a 1-0 Spain win yet again. It wasn't blowing teams away, but it was certainly breaking their spirit over the course of the 90 minutes that was seeing Spain win. Germany were up in the semi-finals and it would be a repeat of the Euro 2008 final. Deutschland had blitzed their way to the semi-finals, defeating England and Argentina and scoring 8 goals in the process. Yet once again they had to succumb to very little possession and hoping to spring on the counter. A third successive 1-0 followed, with Carlos Puyol this time being the man to win the match. Spain were in the final once again. Teams just couldn't cope with having to constantly chase shadows and always be switched on. The final then, another for this group of players. The Dutch were in their sights meaning regardless of outcome, we would have a new winner of the World Cup. The match kicked off to much of the same: Spain possession. The Netherlands had a slightly different answer to getting the ball back though. They just kicked the living crap out of Spain. 9 yellow cards for Holland in the final, and 5 for Spain as well, to be fair. Saw this the most dirty World Cup final of all time. Heitinga ended up with 2 for himself before being shown the red. Far more chances in this game, but still the ball would not end up in the net. It seemed destined to head to penalties until the 116th minute, when the ball popped up perfectly for Andres Iniesta to strike home. Spain were not only European champions, they were now world champions. Spain had picked up their 2nd trophy in a row, both international honours conquered. Del Bosque had built on from Aragona's success and thrived doing so. It wasn't always the most endeared by viewers, however. Sure, the passing was beautiful and technical, but spectators love goals. To build a dynasty though, it's not just enough to win, you have to retain as well, and that was the aim going into Euro 2012. The road to Euro 2012 couldn't have been simpler for Spain. In their qualifying group they won every single game, and things just couldn't look rosier. Over in Tiki-taka paradise Barcelona, Guardiola had continued to win everything. Another La Liga and another Champions League cemented his legacy. However, at the conclusion of the 2011-12 season, Guardiola announced he would be resigning. He bowed out as a serial winner, and his assistant Tito Villanova would replace it. A continuation of the infamous style, but could it emulate the results? Back over in Poland, ahead of Euro 2012, Del Bosque had a problem that had worsened. As stated, for as great as Spain were, goals were never guaranteed. And heading into this tournament, David Villa had bailed out, and Fernando Torres was at Chelsea, and he was struggling. Del Bosque's solution? Obviously, it would have to be a 4-6-0 as his formation, with Fabregas as a false 9. It was radical, it was bold, but in Spain's opening match of Euro 2012, it was only enough for a 1-1 draw against Italy, although Fabregas was the goal scorer. In their second match against the Republic of Ireland, Del Bosque pivoted. Torres returned as a striker, and they won 4-0. Fernando netted a brace, with Fabregas coming off the bench to score the last goal. The final game saw Spain take on Croatia. An unsurprising dominant performance ensued, with Jesus Navas finding the only goal. The result actually had major ramifications on the tournament. Had the game stayed at a draw, Italy would have been knocked out from the group. Alas, that didn't happen though, and Italy would go on to win the next round against England on penalties. Into the knockouts, and the return of Fabregas as a striker experiment resumed. It didn't prove particularly fruitful in this match, but then again, it didn't have to. France were dire, still on the hangover from their terrible 2010 World Cup. They were rubbish. A more surprising double from Xabi Alonso was the difference between the two sides. The semis would see a return of a familiar foe in Portugal. Musical footballers, the far less successful follow-up to musical chairs, was in the offing once again. No room for either Torres or Fabregas in this one. Instead, Del Bosque decided to go with Negredo. He promptly lasted 54 minutes before being replaced by Cesc, however, with the game goalless. And that's how it continued thereon, all the way through normal time and extra time, leading the game to penalties. Casillas delivered the heroics again, and Spain were finalists once more. They probably deserved it overall, and sometimes you do just need a bit of luck. The final then, Spain versus Italy. Remember Italy? The team that Spain drew in the opening game and were nearly knocked out of the tournament in the group stage? Could they prove to be a thorn in La Roja's side again? Not on your Nelly. This Spanish performance was the absolute peak of their powers. They annihilated Italy for 90 straight minutes, winning the final 4-0. Goals from David Silva, Jordi Alba, Fernando Torres, on from the bench obviously, and Juan Mata blew Azzurri away. It had been the one thing that eluded them in their previous triumphs, a signature performance at the crucial time, and now they had it too. They were rampant when so often they had been a bit toothless. Spain were the first European champions to retain their titles, and the first national team in history to win 3 straight major honours. Dynasty secures. We know we're about to move on to chapter 3, where we'll see the downfall of this Spain side, but just for one moment, let's pay homage to possibly the greatest national team in the history of this sport, led by the one and only Vicente Del Bosque. Chapter 3: Legacy. In football, as in life, the old saying goes, what goes up must come down. Spanish football didn't know it yet, but the 5-year dominance of tiki-taka football was coming to a crashing end. Pep Guardiola had left Barcelona to take a sabbatical. Vicente del Bosque remained as Spain manager. Both gentlemen took different approaches. Perhaps for the first time on this journey, the synergy between the two had waned slightly. It was at Barcelona that the tiki-taka supremacy fell first. Bayern Munich in the Champions League semi-finals. A slow, bubbling football revolt had begun to take place in Germany. At domestic level, Bayern were kings. At international level, Germany were kings, but both had been subservient to the masterful Barcelona and Spain sides of the last 5 years. They were bitter, they were angry, they wanted revenge. In the first leg, Bayern had a plan. They chased down every Barcelona shirt with ferocity, not allowing Barca to produce tiki, let alone taka. Bayern pressed so high, Barcelona just didn't have the space to produce their usual quality. Bayern trusted in their high line to have the pace and power to eliminate the threat of the Spaniards. And when they got the ball, they were off. Absolutely rampant on the counter-attack, flying at Victor Valdez's net every time. The scoreline after the first leg, Bayern Munich 4, Barcelona 0. The world was shocked. Had tiki-taka found its kryptonite? The second leg came around with many still thinking the first leg was just a fluke. If anyone can overturn a major deficit, it was Messi and co, of course. But it wasn't a fluke. And Bayern Munich picked up exactly where they left off, executing the same game plan to the same outcome. Barcelona 0, Bayern Munich 3, 7-0 on aggregate. The antidote had been found in Germany. In the other semi-final, Dortmund had overcome Real Madrid. Germany won their first battle in the footballing war. If alarm bells weren't ringing in the Spain camp, they should have been. However, qualifying for the 2014 World Cup had been rather relaxed for La Roja. They had France in their group but still coasted to the finals without a loss, though perhaps there was one cause for concern. They were the lowest scorers of any group winning team. The old problem was alive and kicking, and Del Bosque was worried. Fernando Torres was still in the picture, but really struggling over at Chelsea. David Villa had returned, but at 32 had lost a yard of pace. Instead, they turned towards Brazilian-born Diego Costa. He had been marvellous with Atletico Madrid. Could he provide the goods for Spain too? However, the problem was he hadn't played any part in qualification. He was not used to the setup, so could he adapt? Going into the first game of the tournament, it was a repeat of the previous final. Spain versus the Netherlands. The team was much the same, except Diego Costa was leading the line. 40 minutes in, Spain were happy. They were 1-0 up courtesy of a Xabi Alonso penalty, and things seemed okay. Well, just before half-time, a certain Robin van Persie may have produced perhaps the best-headed goal of all time, but still alive and kicking. However, the second half came and the spirit of Bayern Munich versus Barcelona was in the air. The Netherlands turned on the style, utilising the speed of Iron Robin on the counter. At the 80th minute, it was Spain 1, the Netherlands 5. It ended up being the biggest loss a world champion had ever faced. It was humiliating, but it wasn't over yet. Chile up next and an opportunity for recompense. However, there was now a slight problem. Every team had the blueprint on how to beat Spain, and when you're coming up against Jorge Sampaoli, the manager of Chile at the time, it was always going to be a tough task. They would lose 2-0. Diego Costa once again not being able to provide any goals. And just 2 matches in, Spain were out of the 2014 World Cup. The last match was against Australia in a dead rubber. Both teams had already been knocked out. Del Bosque mixed up the teams with both David Villa and Fernando Torres starting, and they both scored in a 3-0 win. Perhaps some vindication for them. But even so, I don't think if they had played, it would have made much of a difference. To make matters worse, Germany would go on to win the tournament in the most majestic way, beating Brazil 7-1 in the semi-final. Just as football had been revolutionised by Spain, it was now Germany's turn. In a series of crazy results, it was clear the tables had turned. Barcelona 0, Bayern Munich 7, Spain 1, the Netherlands 5, Brazil 1, Germany 7. The divide couldn't be any clearer. Yet it's important to give both Spain and Barcelona their flowers. The kryptonite may have been discovered, but 3 Champions Leagues, 2 Euros and a World Cup would be its legacy, one that Bayern Munich and Germany wouldn't match. In the years since, more evolutions and revolutions have taken place. Barcelona today are completely unrecognisable from that Guardiola side. Guardiola himself is continuing to reinvent the wheel, with his Man City side just completing a historic treble. Spain in this moment is caught in a bit of a quandary. Do they abandon their tiki-taka principles in favour for a new football trend, or try and reimagine tiki-taka in the modern game and find a way to make it successful? It's a tricky one to answer. In subsequent World Cups, they have been knocked out in the round of 16 twice. At the European Championships, another round of 16 defeat was there, although in 2020 they did make it to the semi-finals. Spain were knocked out 2-1 to Japan in the 2022 World Cup. In that game they had 82% of possession. This shows that scoring goals was a problem for La Roja and still is. There is major hope for future Spanish generations, with Gavi and Pedri looking like the reincarnation of Xavi and Iniesta. Though to secure their legacy, it looks more likely that they're going to need a reincarnation of someone like David Villa. It would be remiss of me to end this video on a sour note. Yes, it's true that Spain's dynasty was fleeting, but so is every era of football. The game is constantly evolving and changing in various ways all at once. Seemingly out of nowhere, last year Pep Guardiola seemed to invent a new formation, and now suddenly he's a treble winner. Alas, Spain haven't managed to successfully adapt yet. Regardless, all the props and big ups have to be given to La Roja for breaking the mould. Certainly in the English game, it was a fact of life. If you were short, you weren't going to make it in football. Spain flipped that notion on its head. They developed an identity around what they had and thrived. Luis Aragonés, Vicente Del Bosque and Pep Guardiola all deserve their flowers for the way they have evolutionised the beautiful game. Lastly, it feels like Spain are at a new juncture. Javi, Pedri, Ansu Fati, Pino, Fran Garcia, etc. They're the new stars. With Alba and Busquets have just headed to Inter Miami, that 2008 to 2012 team is over. It's up to this new generation to be the heroes. It remains to be seen whether that's possible, but it'll be fun finding out. Thank you for watching.